Welcome, everybody. It was really exciting when I could see some former, some current clinic students in the waiting room. And it's just so wonderful to be here with Aya, Sienna, and Astha, who, as you saw from the event description, are engaged with clinical teaching at Duke, Berkeley, and NYU. And this event is really just in response to a lot of students reaching out over the years and sort of wanting to learn more about what clinical teaching is, how you get into the field, how you sort of progress from clinical teaching into getting onto the clinical job market. And there's sort of a common thread that sort of ran through a lot of those conversations is that this field is just so opaque with such limited information. So we wanted to bring in 3 people who have navigated this field successfully and to share. They've all offered to be as candid as possible throughout this discussion to sort of share what their journey was like and, you know, offer wisdom based on their experience. So in terms of what we're going to do, we have just under an hour, and I'm going to just briefly introduce the panelists, and then we'll have about half an hour or so of moderated discussion, and then we really want to just open up to questions from all of you for the rest of the time. So I'll just get us started off with the introductions. Aya is a clinical professor of law and supervising attorney at the Duke International Human Rights Clinic. She has extensive expertise in human rights advocacy, clinical teaching, fact-finding, research, litigation, capacity building, and coalition building, both within the US and abroad. And her work has primarily focused on gender and human rights, ESC rights, transitional justice, reproductive rights, and criminal justice. Sienna co-supervises 2 projects at the Global Justice Clinic at NYU, the project on climate justice in the Caribbean and the project on torture, rendition, and detention. In addition to clinical teaching, she also wears a second hat and she works at Crisis Action as the advocacy and campaigns manager, where she builds global coalitions to prevent and protect civilians from war and mass atrocity, with a focus on the war in Yemen and national security abuses in Mali. And Astha is the clinical teaching fellow at the International Human Rights Law Clinic at Berkeley. Prior to joining the clinic, Astha was the Bertha Justice Fellow at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where she worked to defend the constitutional rights of advocates for justice in Palestine and advocates for environmental justice. So clearly all 3 of them have been involved with really inspiring and interesting work around the world, both before they joined clinical teaching as well as alongside it. So what we'll do now is I'll just pose 3 sort of broad questions to them, and we'll get started. So we can go in any particular order, but what led the 3 of you to clinical teaching?
Would you like just one of us to jump in?
Yeah.
Sure. I'm happy to go first. First of all, thanks so much for having us, Gulika, and to the Human Rights Institute. It's really nice to be here and nice to see so many faces interested in clinical teaching. So I have the experience of being a part-time adjunct professor. So I have one foot in kind of the clinical teaching world. And then alongside that, I work 4 days a week in another position doing human rights campaigning. And so it's definitely one that I still feel like I'm in the midst of kind of figuring out where I am in the clinical teaching world, and it's very much an ongoing journey. It's something that I have long been interested in doing. I think that clinical teaching marries such interesting parts of practice, of being at the forefront of being able to have interesting conversations about the movement and push scholarship and knowledge forward, and teaching, and it's a really creative space. So I knew it was something I wanted to look into from kind of early in practice in my last position working on human rights in Haiti, and kind of built up to doing that through taking opportunities to both be in supervision roles with students through internships, being an intern supervisor and other positions, and then also guest lecturing as much as possible, and taking, any of those kind of opportunities so that I could build some experience in kind of the scholarship, the speaking, the supervision of the kind of more academic space. And so then really by happenstance, a space came up at the NYU Clinic when our faculty director was on sabbatical for some need for extra support in the clinic. And that's the context where I was brought on as an adjunct, because the profile of the work that I'd done in the past very much kind of fit the needs of the clinic, and and then have continued to go sort of play that role, and then play a role in also kind of spearheading and suggesting new projects for the clinic, which has led me to stay on and continue in an adjunct position.
Thanks, Sienna. Astha, do you want to go next, and then Aya?
Sure, yeah. So I actually came to law school from Kathmandu, from Nepal, so I was an international student. So anyone who's an international student, if you want to sort of chat about that, I'm happy to do that. And I came to law school sort of interested in transnational work. But I think one thing that I sort of wanted to figure out in law school was what that would look like. I was interested in movement-based work and community-based work, but kind of the difficulty of figuring out exactly what is the role of a transnational and international lawyer in that context was something I, grappled with during law school. And in law school, I did 2 clinics. I did the NYU, I went to NYU and I did the Immigrant Rights Clinic, which was a great sort of litigation experience. And then I did the Global Justice Clinic, which Sienna can obviously talk more about. And I loved my experience in both. And I thought that both of those spaces were really great spaces for kind of doing legal work, but also doing it creatively and in a way in which you have space to think about sort of developing creative legal skills. And in the Global Justice Clinic context, thinking about how to do international work that's rooted in communities that are most impacted by the issues that that we all care about, right? And so then after NYU, I went to this organization called Namati, based in DC, that focuses on legal empowerment. So they do sort of legal work, but it's not sort of litigation, direct representation work. Their work is focused on training community organizers on sort of having legal tools so that they're able to advocate for issues that are impacting their communities. And after that, I went to CCR, Center for Constitutional Rights, where I got sort of a couple of years of experience in litigation. And that was a really great setup, I think, for me. I think those 3, 4 years of legal experience, somewhat transnational, some domestic, was a really good setup for me to kind of get an idea of the range of advocacy tools that are available as a lawyer, and how sort of the promises and the limitations of each. And so after my time at CCR, I decided that and I'd thought about this for a little while, but I decided that I wanted to test out clinical teaching. The clinical teaching sort of academic market is a much more complex one than the market that I entered in, which is the fellowship market. So mine is a limited period fellowship, which I think is a really great opportunity for folks who are not necessarily fully, committed from the beginning to going into the academic world, but are interested in seeing if it's, if clinical teaching and academia is something that that they're interested in. So I'm happy to talk about that process. And I think the thing that is most exciting to me, I started in July. So I was telling everyone earlier that my clinical teaching experience has sort of been constrained by the COVID, by the pandemic. We're fully online. But yeah, I'm really happy to talk about sort of the ways in which clinical teaching allows you to think about creative and creative forms of lawyering and also the constraints.
Thanks, Astha. Aya, do you want to go next?
Yes. So echoing the thanks again to Columbia and the Human Rights Institute for organizing this event and for the invitation. So in terms of my sort of pathway to clinical teaching, I went to law school very interested in pursuing a career in international human rights. So I was certain about that. And I think, as maybe some of you have experienced, that the sort of pathway into clinical teaching is not always very clear. Not that it's intentionally kept a secret, but it's just difficult to find out because there are different ways into it, as Astha just mentioned, in terms of some going through more of the academic market, others through fellowships, for example. So I think often there isn't a lot of clarity about that. So it's, I think, especially great that this event is being held. So having said that, I was interested in human rights, and then I pursued a career really in advocacy, working at a range of different NGOs. And for me, it felt really important to gain that experience. So I wanted to gather, expertise in a range of different substantive areas of international human rights law. So as mentioned during the introduction, I worked in reproductive rights issues and then transitional justice, economic, social, cultural rights, and also at organizations that focused on different types of advocacy strategies. So ranging from more strategic litigation to sort of broader based advocacy, to working more with social movements. And it was also really important for me to work I was interested in working, we call sort of on the ground or in the field. And so I pursued opportunities. I worked in Nepal for a couple of years and then Mexico for a couple of years, because I was interested in working more directly with victims or survivors or different really communities and organizations based in these different countries. And so I think all of this, it's really important to think about as you think through next steps, post-graduation in your career, in terms of the size of organizations, the location of organizations, the types of strategies that different organizations use. So I came to clinical teaching after about 10 years of having practiced international human rights advocacy at different NGOs. And again, that's just something that varies for different people. Some people go into clinical teaching much earlier in their careers. And second thing I'll say is that I had also done a clinical teaching fellowship at Fordham Law School, where I went to law school. And so for me, that both sort of introduced to me the concept of clinical teaching in the international human rights realm. And I loved that experience. And so it really stayed with me in terms of thinking that if another opportunity like that came up, that it was something that I was very interested in doing. And another challenge in this field is that these opportunities don't come up very frequently. And so I continued to work at different organizations, gaining, again, that experience over time. And then the Duke opportunity came up that I then pursued. So I hope that's helpful. And again, it's, partly to show that there really are many different pathways into this work.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I think that's exactly what I was going to say to conclude before moving on to the next question, that I think it was so interesting to hear about all of the three pretty distinct pathways to clinical teaching. And it also sounds like all of you had experienced clinics either through a fellowship or as a student or in some shape or form, which is what also drew you to it. Astha, like you, I'm not from the US, I'm from India, and I experienced a clinic for the first time only as an LLM. So if you had asked me, 5 years earlier, if I ever would have seen myself in a clinical role, I wouldn't have even known that it existed, because when I was in law school in India and practicing as a lawyer there, it wasn't even something that I was exposed to. So it's quite interesting to see how often some kind of engagement with the clinic is often what has led people to ultimately choosing to be a part of it. And I guess my next question is, what has been some of the most both rewarding and challenging aspects of clinical teaching? And when I say that, I mean in the broad sense of the term, because when Aya, when you were talking about all the skills that you had engaged with before you came, I think when I think of some of the challenges, firstly, it's, you're not expected to be good at just one skill, but in some ways you're teaching a whole range of different skills, even if your project only uses some of it. So thinking about what's rewarding and challenging, I guess at all levels, from, teaching the seminar, which is, both broad and deep, but also in terms of supervision on projects, as well as actually like partner relationships and managing the project. So it would be interesting to sort of learn from the three of you what your thoughts were at all in terms of all of those three things.
I can start if we want to go in reverse order this time. And actually touching on one of the points that you just made, Gulika, I think one of the simultaneously challenging and rewarding things for me about clinical teaching is just that we do use such a range of different strategies and also work on different topics. And so with a few of the projects that we've taken on in our field work, there have been instances where the focus area has not been something that matches up exactly with my previous substantive experience. And so the opportunity and challenge of both, learning about that area of law very, very quickly and really immersing myself in it to be able to supervise projects and teach it. I find, again, that combination of challenge and fulfilling. And I love that about it because it does bring variety to the job and creates an environment where I'm sort of constantly being challenged and stimulated by new ideas and new topic areas and new institutions or partners with whom we collaborate. And I think also really forces me to be current and up to date about different human rights issues that are relevant. So I find that to be, that's something that jumps out at me. And then something else that I find really fulfilling is the professional relationship aspect. And so working with students each semester and, teaching them, but also given that it's a clinic, really very much working alongside of them and being inspired by students and their creativity and really thought-provoking questions. And, so very much also learning from students in many instances. Also, working with other clinical faculty at Duke, the international law faculty more broadly, and even the wider community of international human rights clinicians. So for, Gulika and I were on a panel last summer. We hadn't met in person, but we work with colleagues at 2 other law schools. And so this sense of, I think, community that really exists between international human rights clinics at different schools, I also really enjoy. And I think that also goes back to that point about really sort of knowing yourself and what you enjoy. And for me, that relationship interactive piece is really important for any job that I do. And so that, as you think about clinical teaching and other types of opportunities that you might be thinking about, to really get to know and be honest with yourself about what you enjoy doing day in and day out. That something might theoretically sound interesting in the abstract, but to really come to an understanding of what that looks like on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I really want to second what Aya just said about the sort of collaborative aspect of it. There's so many layers of collaboration to clinical teaching, right? Like you're collaborating with your students, you're collaborating with your colleagues. I work at a clinic where a clinic that's directed by 2 professors, Professor Fletcher and Professor Althodes. And so I collaborate with them, they're my colleagues, but I also collaborate with students, right? And I think those different levels of collaboration and those different types of collaboration are ones that I really enjoy. But to emphasize the fact that a lot of what you're doing day to day is talking to students, working with students, and that's something that you need to think about. That's what your day to day is going to look like. The other thing that I think is really rewarding about clinical teaching, or has been for me at least, is the space and the ability to kind of think about academic research and writing, if that's something that you're interested in. I think I came in wanting to push myself to do more of the research and writing. It's not something that you often have space or time for when you're working, at an organization, when you're litigating. And I think clinical teaching at its best moments gives you the time and space and the support and sort of the environment to do that, where you are around colleagues who hopefully encourage your writing and are there for you to kind of bounce ideas around with. So that has been the case for me. And I think for folks who are interested in doing practical work, but also want to be in academia. It's sort of a good middle ground. I think one of the challenges of international human rights clinical teaching in particular that I'm seeing now, and that I saw in the Global Justice Clinic as well, is the issue of location. Like, if you're interested in doing work that's grounded and led by the folks who are impacted by the issues that you care deeply about, but you're based in a global North institution, and you want to do sort of that kind of work in other parts of the world, it's a challenge. And the fact that you're constrained by the semester kind of timeline is also a challenge. And I think there's a lot of ways in which you work around it and develop relationships with folks and other deep and sort of long-standing relationships with folks in other parts of the world to try to get over or surmount that location challenge. But it's still a big hurdle.
Yeah, I mean, I would 100% endorse everything that's been said. I mean, I think I really want to underscore what Aya said about knowing what it is that you enjoy doing. I think that's true for clinical teaching, and it's true for anything in the human rights field. And we talk about it as a field, but it's so radically different to talk about something that might be, very research focused, single issue, to something like clinical teaching, where maybe you're just having a lot of meetings and talking to students and working in a lot of different ways. And depending on your personality and what you enjoy, one of those might be far more rewarding than the other, even though they both, broadly speaking, fall under the human rights legal career pathway. And that's so hard to know about yourself a lot when you're starting out, but I think it's just a really important thing to keep reflecting on as you become able to start making choices about where you want to go in your career. I mean, I enjoy many of the same things and find them the most rewarding that have been said. I think the collaboration with students, with colleagues, with external partners is huge, and would also really endorse what Astha just said about some of those challenges about your kind of position, your geographical position. I also think with collaborators and partners, the fact that we are on semester timelines and that we have new students coming onto projects, and that we want to ensure that students are leading those projects, and what that means in terms of kind of some of the orientation of how we do the work and the timeline that the work can be on, which can be, just sometimes a lot more drawn out than it would be if you're in a smaller NGO and responding to things quickly on projects. I think that can be sometimes a challenge that, you just have to navigate. And again, I think building those kind of strong working relationships with partners over a significant period of time is key to that. A piece that I really love is that there is so much room for creativity and stepping into types of projects that, maybe wouldn't clearly fit into a program stream in an NGO, or that are on a different timeline, or that are about, analysing, looking back at the field itself. And, I think some of the work that Columbia's done on human rights advocates in the global North's position with grassroots groups in the global South is such a great example of that. And so I think there's ways to be both creative about the types of projects taken on, and about the types of work about the human rights field itself that are really rewarding, and that, may not be able to be done in other scenarios, in other contexts in the same way. And then, of course, I mean, I think that the relationship with students and learning from students is such a big part of this. And I think also being able to be part of helping shape with students kind of their perspective on the field and the ways that they think about how they do this work. And, the NYU Clinic is very big on thinking about legal empowerment strategies, thinking, as many of our, all our clinics are, thinking about our own position as global North actors and how we relate to our partners. And I think being able to kind of see students take that on and work with them as they're figuring out how they want to work in this field, as well as what they want to work on, is really important and very rewarding when kind of students come out of a clinic, as I did, seeing a space for themselves in the human rights field after having gone through a clinic in a way that maybe they weren't sure there was that kind of space for them before. So yeah, I think those both, you know, rewards and challenges. I guess the only other challenge I'd point to is, you know, just balancing all the different competing aspects of the role, carving out spaces for things like doing scholarship, but also because there is so much creativity and flexibility, kind of balancing when you can't jump into a new project, or where there's a need to kind of say no to certain things. And I think that can be a real challenge when you maybe don't have some of the institutional constraints that you might have in other places. It's a gift and something to grapple with at the same time.
Yeah, thank you all so much. It was just really wonderful to hear that from all of you, because sometimes these are just thoughts in my own head. So it's nice to know that there are shared experiences in other universities as well. And I really couldn't agree more with the fact that, I mean, sometimes like even the aspects that are the most challenging are in fact the most rewarding. And, you know, I was just thinking about my own work in India and how I would litigate, but feel that litigation was limited. So then I had to do advocacy in other spaces or write in other spaces. And it's so unique to have one job where you get to do all of those things instead of, I mean, you still feel like you're being pulled in different directions, but at least it's all within one role instead of sort of spread across. And then I think what you were saying about both the challenge and how meaningful it is to be able to engage on a range of different issues and a range of different skills at the same time. And as you were talking, I was actually reminded we had project rounds in our seminar last evening, and one of the students was sharing how, you know, they worked on the right to sanitation last semester, but now they're working on the right to housing. And how can we position ourselves as experts when we've just started learning this? And I think, you know, some of the wisdom that came out from other students of the class is, one is firstly, we're not experts, which is, you know, we're partners in this, and sort of being transparent about reframing, I think, ourselves as partners and not experts at any step. But also that, like, I think a big part of education, whether legal education or clinical education, is sort of just learning how to learn, because you can't even anticipate what rights you're going to be working on or what strategies you're going to be using 5 years from now, 10 years from now. But one thing I was sharing with them was, I think if you can develop the skill to learn how to learn, then you'll be fine, you know, later on, both this semester. But so we were sort of reflecting on what is the process of learning. And I think that's something that's not just applicable to students, but to supervisors within the clinic as well. I think we're sort of constantly learning, and it's just, and I think all of you have said this, but we're learning from our partners, we're learning from our students. I can see Shannon is in the chat, and she was one of the students on one of the projects that I supervised last year. And I just learned so much from her throughout the year, not just in terms of the issues and skills, but also what values do you bring to the work that you do? How do you engage with people? What is your approach, sort of a critically responsive approach to this work? And absolutely, I think there's just been a lot of learning through the collaborations, but it's also what makes the work really joyful and meaningful, especially when some of this work can be quite challenging and isolating and feel like, you know, the end is never in sight. So I think being able to do it alongside other people has definitely been incredibly rewarding. So one of the last things I wanted to ask the three of you, and then we'll open up for questions, is, you know, what advice would you have for people who are interested in clinical teaching? And one thing the three of you said, which is sort of advice and I thought was really wise, is to understand yourself and what you enjoy. And often that's hard to do till you've tried it. So what were some of the things you did in law school, whether being in a clinic, but being in a clinic and as a student and supervisor is a little bit different, or like through internships or just other experiences? What were some of the things you did while in law school? What were some of the things you did after law school to try to sort of understand yourself and your interests better? And I mean, I know this is a lifelong journey, and I think my own interests also keep evolving over time. So advice with respect to that, one piece of wisdom, so sort of just building on what you've already shared, but any other advice as well that you might have for people who have joined us today?
I can go first also because I wanted to jump in on something that you just said, Gulika. I think a lot of students and new lawyers feel this pressure to kind of specialize and become experts on a certain thematic area of law, which is noble in the sense that you want to be really good at what you're doing. But I do agree that part of the skill of being a good advocate and being a good lawyer is sort of being able to see what will be required of me in the future. What are the skills and tools that will be required of me in the future, and sort of being able to shift yourself and what you're doing to serve the community that you're interested in serving, because issues that impact whoever you're interested in serving are not always going to be the same exact thing, right? So I think one piece of advice is to not sort of feel so bogged down and like, oh, I'm not an expert on, well, the human right to sanitation, you know. I think what's important is, or at least what has been important for me, has been to feel connected to communities that I care about, right? To stay connected to communities, to constantly show up as much as possible so that you are familiar with what are the relevant human rights issues and what are the tools that are important to folks, right? To me, it's not been so much about like, oh, I can relay whatever legal standard is applicable in the context of whether it's immigration or environmental justice, but it's more like, okay, what are the advocacy tools that I can use to address these types of things? And I think that's my range of types of experience, both sort of in the immigrant rights clinic, where I was mostly doing, I was doing like some litigation and then a range of other types of legal tools, and then in the Global Justice Clinic, where a lot of the work that I was doing was sort of interview investigative and then some report writing. And then in, at CCR, it was purely litigation. Being able to access a range of those skills and recognizing what I'm more or less interested in was really helpful. And I was actually talking with some students a couple of days ago about how sometimes it's easier to know where to find. Sometimes you know that if you go to an organization, you're going to be able to work on, say, immigration, but you don't know whether you're going to have access to those, to training on skills. And so I would just encourage folks to think in those terms as well, and talk to mentors about, if I go to this organization, do you think I'm going to be able to develop this particular skill, or will I just become an expert on this issue, but not necessarily kind of develop the relevant skills that I feel I want to explore. My other piece of advice, just as a fellow, having gone down that path, is that I think it's a really good way, I think I've already said this, but I think it's a really good way to dip your toes into this field and see whether it's something you're interested in, because I think from the outside, it can look really different from what it is in the inside, right? And so I think the sort of academic job market can feel really daunting, and causes folks to select out, to self-select out of the field, whereas the fellowship route is, job security is less of a guarantee, but it's also that you're able to sort of access this field without it feeling like such a daunting process.
I can come in next and give you the final word, Aya. I 100% endorse all of that. I think that's really wise advice, Astha. The skill building is so important, right? I think what we've been saying about clinical teaching is you have to have many different things in your toolbox. And so I think thinking about both in law school and subsequent to law school, kind of being a generalist in some way is probably one of the most useful things that you can do. And, having, I think, in so many ways, like networks, your relationships with communities, with partners, with potential faculty, but I recognize that it's hard for some people to have relationships with faculty, and that's about the challenge with the opaqueness of this field, but your relationships with partners, your past work and with collaborators, I think are then all the things, the richness that you bring in to a clinic and what you can offer to the clinic with your own kind of vision of the work. And so that's a really important thing to develop. I mean, as we've kind of all alluded to, there are differing paths into clinical teaching. There's fellowship routes where, you know, that can be between 3 or 5 years of practice experience to go into. There's the academic job market route, and then there's also, you know, kind of coming in 5, 7, 10 plus years of practice and moving laterally into either a non-tenure kind of track position where you're supervising a project on some kind of fixed term or renewable contract, or going into a tenure track position. So it's a kind of field with lots of different entry points to it. I mean, I think that in addition to skill building and you know, your networks and your own knowledge of what you want to do and what really interests you, I mean, I do think that there's value in just thinking about the specific types of things around supervision and, you know, seminar teaching. And so going back to sort of what I said in my introduction, when I kind of realized that this was a field of interest, and part of the reason for why I realized that was knowing through working with a small NGO that I like doing lots of different things, but that I also was really interested in being able to kind of have the space to have a critical lens on human rights lawyering as a field and think about different types of innovations and critical ways of approaching the field, and realized that I'd like to get a foot into adjuncting. Was then, yeah, to try and see where are there talks that, you know, even if I'm fairly junior in my organization, that they'd be willing for me to kind of step in and go and do. Where can I offer to supervise interns even if I am relatively junior, so that then as those positions come up, whether it be for fellowships or adjuncting, that you're bringing both some practice but also showing that you've demonstrated an ability to kind of understand how to convey information and to supervise others, that I think can be really helpful. I mean, on adjuncting specifically, I think one thing is you know, you have to have an open mouth to get fed. Like, you have to go out and kind of make it known that you're interested in adjuncting. And so I was very lucky that NYU kind of came along, but NYU was by no means the first institution that I kind of like reached out to and said, hey, I'm quite interested in thinking about pursuing this. Do you have any advice? And so in the same way that, you know, that's a lot of, for good and bad, often for bad, a lot of that kind of networking is part of getting your foot into the human rights world. I think that particularly for these more ad hoc opportunities that may come up in clinical teaching, it is important to be proactive within your networks about, you know, just making it known that that's something that you're interested in doing.
So echoing quite a few of the comments that have already been made by Astha and Sienna, and especially the first point that Astha made in terms of, I think, the importance of not being overly concerned about, you know, doing exactly X, Y, and Z, or, you know, being an expert in a very specific area. And I think I would really encourage people to pursue their interests. So whether in the form of classes or internships or volunteer opportunities. And, you know, I think that you might see sort of common threads in these different experiences that are not necessarily obvious to a future employer, but there are ways in which you can explain it and talk through it where the narrative does make sense, you know, and that these, you know, apparently on their surface, perhaps more disparate opportunities do tell a common story about your interest and your passion in different areas. So I would really encourage that. And also, I think as Sienna talked about the relationship building aspect as well, and making known to people what you're interested in. So I have many memories in law school of, you know, going to different events and waiting in long lines to talk to the speaker afterwards. I think in some ways now it's easier in our virtual world to be able to contact people by emailing them. And, you know, I find that people in the human rights field are really open and interested in talking to students about the nature of different positions and different human rights issues. And I would really emphasize that point about cultivating those relationships when you meet somebody who's doing the kind of work that you might be interested in doing someday. Both sometimes they can actually lead to direct work opportunities. A few consulting positions I've taken on in the past have very much come out of, professional relationships with people, having worked with them in different contexts. So I would really encourage that, going to different talks and workshops, and then really taking that to the next level in terms of then following up with people when you have additional questions. And also applying that specifically to the clinical context. Even though many schools have clinics, the way that they're run can be quite different across different institutions. And even within international human rights clinics, some that focus on litigation, some that do advocacy more broadly, some have, shorter sort of semester long projects, some have longer term projects. The nature of partner organizations or clients with whom clinics work can also really, really differ. Clinics can be differently situated within the law school more broadly. And so also to keep in mind that there are a lot of differences when it comes down to the specifics of clinics. And so for this as well, to try to gain an understanding of that, again, through the same way of, reaching out to people faculty who work in those clinics, for example. And finally, I would say also, as you pursue whatever the path is that you're interested in, including clinical teaching, to not be too dismayed by setbacks, which is obviously easier said than done, but, we all experience them. When I think back on opportunities where I thought something was, the ideal position or a dream job and it didn't work out, and, new opportunities do come along, even when it doesn't always seem like it at the time. And so when that does happen, which it inevitably does over the course of a long career, to understand that something else will come along, and to, as much as possible, sort of find ways to sort of move on and look for new opportunities in those moments. And to know that there's this, wide community of clinical practitioners and different organizations out there that you can really turn to for information and just finding out more about this field.
Thank you all so much. I also just, everything you said definitely really resonates with me. I just wanted to build on the last thing that Aya just said about not feeling disappointed, just because, I think someone had shared this earlier today, that some of these positions just don't open up that frequently. So it's really not a reflection of anyone's skills or abilities. And I think the other thing is that, as Aya had shared, in terms of actually working in practice for several years also helps you when you're teaching. So sometimes actually when things don't work out, it just opens up possibilities for something else. And then the skills that you gain in that other experience, or the expertise you have, or the things you discover about yourself, then just inform and inform your clinical teaching, and your teaching will just be that much stronger as a result of it. And part of it is skills, but just because we've talked about a lot of collaborations, part of it is also just interpersonal skills beyond legal skills, right? How do you manage a team? How do you supervise? How do you provide not just positive feedback, but also constructive feedback? I think these are all skills you often learn when you work on other teams as well before you come in, because I think a big part of clinical teaching is not just being a good lawyer or a good advocate, but also, or even a seminar teacher, but actually being able to effectively supervise. And at least for me, I think having both experienced good and bad supervisors in my own life, and also having sort of run my own nonprofit in India and sort of getting feedback from people who were reporting to me, like, I think all of those things helped me develop as a human being beyond a human rights advocate, which I think has in some ways been even more valuable while teaching than any specific skill, because I think we've all talked about the skill, how those skills and the issues anyway shift over time and sort of evolve over time. So in the time that we have left, and thank you, the three of you, like so much for doing this. And I think the other thing I will also say on the networking piece is, as someone who came from a different country and was not at all familiar with how networking operates in the US, and I still don't think it's something that comes naturally to me at all, and it's something I actively avoid doing because it can feel quite uncomfortable. I agree with what Sienna said and what Aya said as well about it being worthwhile, and maybe not even thinking of it as networking, but thinking of it as having a conversation with someone who has a shared interest as you. And I think then it can feel, I don't think it's about talking to 100 people. It's about identifying who you want to talk to, whose career trajectory has actually been interesting to you, and then developing, I think depth over breadth often has really helped me in my own career. And I mean, just listening to the three of them, I was like, oh, I should get a drink with them once this pandemic is over, or touch base with them even before it is. And so I think just thinking of that, and also if this is helpful at all, I think people who are involved with clinical teaching are used to advising students all the time. So it's kind of in their role to have these kinds of conversations. And it's a part of their job to have these kinds of conversations. You're certainly not taking up their time. And it's actually something they, we all talked about how this is something we chose to do because it's something we enjoy doing and brings, meaning and joy to our lives. And I think I can only speak for myself, but a lot of people have spoken to me in my own career, and I think we just sort of see it as paying it forward. So absolutely just feel free to reach out to the four of us, but other people as well whose careers you might find interesting after this panel. So let's use the last 10 minutes or so for questions. And I can see a question from Rosario, and I know, Jessica, you had a question too, but for other people, just feel free to either unmute yourself and ask a question, or virtually raise your hand on Zoom, or put the question in the chat, whatever, and then I'll either read out your question or call on you. So starting with Rosario's question on being an LLM student, and is that JD required? I mean, it definitely is. So I'm an former LLM myself, and the director of the Human Rights Clinic at Columbia is also a former LLM. So actually we don't even have anyone who has done a JD. I mean, we have supervising attorneys who did, but at least within this clinic, it's possible. And Sienna, did you say you're a former LLM as well?
Yeah, I don't have a JD either.
Do you want to sort of jump in on that and sort of share if you think your experience might have been different from someone who had a JD?
I'm not sure that it is really. I mean, I think for many of us who are foreign students and did different degrees elsewhere and then did an LLM, I'm not sure that it puts you at much of a disadvantage. I suppose I can't really speak to the tenure track job market, so I wouldn't venture any thoughts on that. But as a supervising attorney, I really don't think it does.
Yeah, and as a supervising attorney, the other thing I'll say is it's quite helpful to actually have a network in that region, right? So my work is focused on Kashmir, and the fact that I'm from India, have worked in South Asia for several years before moving here, is I think what has really helped me with my supervision. I think Astha was talking about how it's really difficult to form some of those relationships transnationally. And I think for me, the fact that I had all of those relationships and sort of brought those relationships into the clinic was definitely helpful. On the sort of academic job market, Aya, did you want to jump in on if you know if there's any difference between JDs and LLMs as they navigate that market?
I'm not sure about that. And actually, I didn't go through kind of the formal market process. So I wish I could speak more to that, but I don't have a lot to contribute on that point.
Sounds good. Jessica, you had a question. Do you want to just unmute yourself and ask the question? And everyone else, just feel free to put questions in the chat.
Yes, I know that you spoke to a lot of this already, but I was wondering if maybe each of you could say like the most important things students can be doing or thinking about while they're in law school if they're interested in pursuing human rights clinical teaching.
it's hard to pick one, the most important. I don't know. I think the thing that was most important for me was actually doing a clinic, maybe, if I had to pick one thing. You can't know what you're getting into if you haven't tried it out. So if you, and also like my clinical experiences were the best, the thing that sort of made my law school experience the best. So I assume most of you, if you're in law school, have done a clinic or plan to do a clinic, but if you didn't or hadn't, then I would highly recommend that.
Yeah.
Yeah, +1 to that. And I think volunteering and interning with places that are not purely like legal litigation, but kind of give you experience and exposure to a range of other advocacy, activism, community building kind of worlds and skills.
Yeah, I would say ditto to doing a clinic for sure. And then also, you know, I know Columbia and many law schools hold human rights events throughout the year. And so to really attend those, I think sometimes in the moment, you know, if you're preparing for an exam or have a paper due or have a ton of reading, you know, you might think that you should prioritize that. But I think it's equally, if not more important at times, to attend those human rights events. You know, again, for gaining exposure to different topic areas, different actors in the field. And so, you know, to take advantage of those opportunities that your school offers.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. There were some students who messaged me privately to say they had a class at 1 or meetings at 1, but they said to share that it's been so helpful to learn from the three of you, and it's really demystified the opaqueness of getting into clinical teaching. So thank you from them as well. Was there anyone else who had any questions for Astha, Sienna, and Aya? Or were there any questions you had for each other as you were listening to each other speak? I can see Lizzie, there's a question on, can you extend clinical teachings to communities? Lizzie, do you want to just unmute yourself and sort of build on that question?
Hello, everyone. Hello and greetings. Like my work has to do with communities, and the communities need clinical teachings, but they're not very educated. So can we, you know, plan a coaching system where we can bring them up, because they need to benefit from the experience that we are sharing here. It's very vital that we go down to the community. So I want to find out if we can have a program for the communities, especially in developing countries like my own country. I'm from Nigeria. I'm Lizzie Ibine from Nigeria.
Thank you, Lizzie, for that important question. Did any of you want to, or all of you sort of want to respond?
I can come in first on this. Thank you, Lizzie, for the question. Something that we've been talking about at NYU at the moment is that a lot of what gets taught in clinics around skill building is really something that we should be working to try and make more accessible to community activists. So whether that is at the level of demystifying some of the international human rights institutions, so engaging, you know, with different parts of the UN, with special rapporteurs, other explainer videos that we can do that are about kind of what does it actually take to kind of successfully navigate these systems, but also thinking about other ways that we can make teachings around understanding big data, crunching numbers, open source fact-finding, these kind of tools that are increasingly part of what it means to be a human rights practitioner, kind of in a cross-discipline way, accessible. I mean, so that is something that I don't know if and how and when exactly it's going to look like, but definitely something that we're very, very aware of and trying to figure out. I mean, I think, of course, to be fully transparent, one challenge with law schools fully opening up some of these teachings to the public is that students pay to attend them. And so I think there are some like institutional limits on how much teaching of any kind in a law school gets made open. But I think the challenge that you're raising is a very, very important one to kind of break down some of the elitism and geographical barriers of some of who this knowledge is available to. And I think one of the few silver linings of COVID has been that it's shown us the different ways that we can teach and connect and creatively share knowledge. And so that's really a challenge that all of us in these institutions should kind of be taking up. I'm not sure if that fully responds to your question, but again, thank you for raising it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I sort of was thinking about as you were asking the question, as Sienna, as you were answering, is the question of sort of transnational collaboration between students as well. It's not something that I have experienced before in sort of my current clinical position or in my past clinical experiences, where students from the global north are able to collaborate directly with student teams in other parts of the world. But I think it would be a really great sort of experiment and something to, with a lot of challenges, of course, but something to think about as well. So thank you for that question.
I'll just really quickly echo Sienna's point, and thank you, Lizzie, for that question about, I do think with the pandemic and everything being done, so much being done now remotely, that, you know, for example, we run a human rights event series at Duke, and we record all of our events. So that's not so much on the skills building, but just kind of different experts in human rights talking about different topic areas. And, you know, that doesn't get to the challenge of people in communities where there isn't access to digital technologies in terms of Wi-Fi and internet access. So that I think is something else that we have to keep thinking about to make sure that in this increasingly remote environment that we're not actually, you know, furthering some of those structural barriers. But, you know, in line with that a lot of these events and webinars are now accessible to the public. And so hopefully open up opportunities for people who aren't based at law schools or based in the global north to access some of those.
Yeah, thank you so much, firstly, Lizzie. I think that's such an important question. And I think a lot of what is rewarding about clinical teaching and learning is attached to privilege and the luxury of actually being able to sit back and reflect on how we approach our work. One thing we do on the project that I supervise is the fact-finding methodology. It's a participatory action research methodology. So the students in Kashmir and the students in the clinic are sort of being trained on fact-finding skills, on interviewing skills, on how do you lead focus group discussions, how do you engage in advocacy at the same time. So the clinic students are sort of one set of students amongst all of the other Kashmiri students as well. So I think, you know, maybe just the approach to the project could be one way in which to extend at least some aspects of the skills, and then also just viewing it as really like a mutual exchange, because I think a lot of the students there are the ones who are really teaching our students, like, how do you navigate such a challenging geopolitical context? How do you engage in advocacy, you know, when there are closing space measures and, you know, all kinds of other issues surrounding human rights work. So I think the skill building and knowledge transfer really works both ways. But thank you so much for raising that question. I know we're at time, so I just wanted to conclude by thanking the three of you so much for your time and for sort of sharing your experiences and wisdom with the group. And it was just really, really a wonderful experience, even for me, to be able to listen and learn from all of you. So thank you so much again, and take care, everyone. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.